Joan Crawford adopted 4 children. 2 of them spent the rest of their lives telling the world she was a monster. The other 2 swore she was the only mother they ever wanted. They grew up in the same house, but they did not grow up in the same home. Before we go any further, if stories like this one stay with you long after they end, subscribe to Darkest Gates, where the people history thinks it knows turn out to be someone else entirely. To understand what happened to Joan Crawford's 4 children, you have to start before any of them existed. You have to understand the woman who decided, against the customs of her time and the laws of the state she lived in, that she was going to be a mother no matter what it took. She was not born Joan Crawford. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas, sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. The exact year is one of the small mysteries she left behind, because she gave different answers at different points in her life, and the records from that place and time were never tidy to begin with. What is not in doubt is the kind of childhood she had. Her father left before she could remember him. Her mother remarried, and that marriage fell apart too. There was poverty, there was instability, and there were stretches where Lucille worked menial jobs in exchange for room and board at the schools she attended, scrubbing and serving while the other children studied. That is the thing you have to hold onto about her. Before she was a star, before the name and the eyebrows and the shoulder pads, she was a girl who knew exactly what it felt like to be unwanted. And a person who grows up that way often spends the rest of their life trying to build the opposite, trying to construct a family so secure and so loved that no child inside it could ever feel the way she once felt. By the late 1930s, she had built almost everything else. She had clawed her way out of poverty and into the very center of Hollywood. She had become one of the biggest stars at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a woman whose face sold magazines and whose every marriage and divorce was front-page news. She married Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the son of Hollywood royalty, and divorced him. She married the actor Franchot Tone and divorced him too. And somewhere in all of that, she discovered that the one thing the work and the marriages could not give her was a child of her own. She was unable to have children. That door was closed, so she chose another one. In 1940, single and between husbands, Joan Crawford adopted a baby girl. Adopting as an unmarried woman was not legal in California at the time, so she did what people with money and determination have always done. She went around the rule. She arranged the adoption through Nevada, in Las Vegas, where the obstacles could be made to disappear. The baby had been born in June of 1939, and Joan named her Christina. She was the first. And from the very beginning, there was something about Christina that mirrored her mother, a stubbornness, a will, a refusal to bend, that would shape everything that came after. But Joan did not want an only child. She had grown up feeling alone, and she did not want that for her daughter. So she kept going. Around 1942, she adopted a baby boy, and she named him Christopher. And then something happened that you rarely hear about, because it gets lost behind the more famous chapters. The boy's birth mother came back for him. By some accounts, it was an attempt to extort money from a wealthy and famous woman. Whatever the truth of it, the child was taken from the household, and Joan, who had already begun to think of him as her son, lost him. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Before any of the children whose fates we are going to follow, there was a child who simply vanished from her life, reclaimed and gone. Whatever she felt about it, she did not stop. In 1943, now married to her third husband, the actor Philip Terry, she adopted another baby boy. They named him Philip Terry Jr. The marriage to Terry would not last either. They divorced in 1946. And when it ended, Joan did something that tells you a great deal about how she saw her children and how she saw herself. She changed the boy's name. He was no longer Philip Terry Jr., a name tied to a husband she was finished with. He became Christopher Crawford. He carried her name now and only hers. Then came the last two. In January of 1947, Joan adopted a pair of fraternal twins, two baby girls born on the 13th of that month. Their birth mother was a young woman named Theda, and she died only 7 days after the babies were born. So these two girls entered the world already having lost the woman who carried them. And within weeks they entered the home of one of the most famous women alive. Joan named them Catherine and Cynthia. Everyone called them Kathy and Cindy. And so by 1947 the family was complete. One mother and 4 children. Christina, the willful eldest. Christopher, the boy with the borrowed name. And the twins, Kathy and Cindy, who would grow up to remember a completely different woman than the one their older siblings would describe. 4 children, gathered one at a time by a woman who had decided that the loneliness of her own childhood would end with her. She gave them a beautiful house in Brentwood. She gave them her name, which was one of the most valuable names in the country. She gave them, by every account including their own, a level of attention and control that few children ever experience. What she could not give them, it turned out, was a single shared truth about what that childhood had actually been. Because the strange and painful thing about this family, the thing that makes it worth telling at all, is that all 4 of these children grew up under the same roof, raised by the same mother, and 2 of them walked away certain they had survived something terrible, while the other 2 walked away certain they had been loved. That divide is where the real story begins, and it begins with the first child she ever brought home. Christina was the one who came first, and in many ways she was the one who set the terms for everything that followed. If you want to understand the woman who would one day write the most famous book ever written about a Hollywood mother, you have to understand the little girl who arrived in 1940 into a house ruled by someone exactly as strong-willed as she was. Because that is the thing about Christina that almost everyone who knew the family agrees on, even the people who would later despise her. She was not a passive child. She was not easily managed. She had a will of her own, sharp and early, and she had it in a household run by a woman who did not tolerate being challenged by anyone, let alone a child. Joan Crawford had built her entire life on discipline and control. She had pulled herself out of poverty through sheer refusal to bend, and here was a daughter who, from the time she could speak, seemed determined to bend right back. You can see how that becomes a problem. 2 people made of the same iron, in the same house, one of them an adult with absolute authority and the world's adoration, the other a small child who had not yet learned that she was supposed to lose. Christina later described a childhood of rigid rules and harsh punishments, of a mother whose affection could turn cold without warning, of a home where the rules seemed designed less to raise a child than to break a will. The people who defended Joan described the same household entirely differently. They saw a strict mother in an era when strict mothers were ordinary, a disciplinarian raising children to be grateful and well-mannered, nothing more. The exact truth of those early years remains one of the most argued over questions in all of Hollywood history, and we will get to that argument in time. But what is not in dispute is that the relationship between Joan and Christina was charged from the start, and it only grew more so as the girl got older. In 1950, when Christina was around 10 years old, Joan enrolled her at the Chadwick School in Palos Verdes, California, a boarding school well down the coast from the Brentwood house. Christopher would follow her there not long after. Boarding school was not unusual for the children of wealthy and busy parents, and Joan's career was demanding. But there is another way to read it, and Christina certainly read it that way. To a child, being sent away is being sent away, regardless of the reason printed on the enrollment form. The grand house, the famous name, the photographers who came to capture the smiling family portraits, none of that changed the simple fact that the children spent large stretches of their childhood living somewhere other than home. And that gap between the image and the experience is something Christina would carry for the rest of her life, because she had grown up inside one of the most photographed families in the country. There were pictures of Joan kissing her children at train stations, Joan reading to them, Joan surrounded by all four of them in matching outfits, the very picture of devoted motherhood. Christina grew up knowing that the woman the public saw and the woman she lived with were not always the same person. And there is a particular kind of confusion that does to a child, learning early that the truth and the photograph can be two different things. As she grew into a young woman, Christina did something that surprised no one who understood her. She decided to become an actress. She would chase the same spotlight her mother stood in. Whether that was a daughter following the only path she had ever seen, or a daughter trying to step out from a shadow by entering the same business that cast it, is the kind of question this story keeps refusing to answer cleanly. She studied, she trained, and she began to find work. She appeared on Broadway. She had a role in the Elvis Presley film Wild in the Country, and she landed a part on the daytime soap opera The Secret Storm. It was that soap opera that produced one of the strangest episodes in the entire history of this family. In 1968, Christina, then in her late 20s, fell ill and had to be hospitalized, leaving her role unfilled. And Joan Crawford, by then in her early 60s, stepped in and played the part herself. A woman past 60 playing a character her own 20-something daughter had been cast as. To some it looked like a mother helping her child keep a job. To others it looked like something far stranger, a woman who could not bear to stay out of any spotlight, even one that belonged to her daughter, even one inside a hospital story. You can read it however you like. Both readings have been argued. What it tells you, either way, is that the line between them, between mother and daughter, between rival and family, had never been clean and never would be. By the time she reached adulthood, Christina had become a striking, determined, complicated woman. She had grown up the eldest of four, the first chosen, the one most like her mother, and somehow because of all of that, the one most at war with her. She married and divorced and married again. She built a life that kept its distance from Brentwood. But she was not the only child in that house who learned early how to put distance between himself and his mother. Her younger brother learned it too. He just did it by running. Of all four children, Christopher is the one we know the least about. And there is something fitting in that, because Christopher spent most of his life trying to get away. Away from the house, away from the name, away from the cameras and the rules and the woman at the center of all of it. He is the child who left the smallest record behind, and the deeper you go into his story, the more you understand that the small record was the point. He did not want to be found. He had come into the family in 1943, the baby boy Joan, adopted during her marriage to Philip Terry, the one whose name she changed to Christopher Crawford after that marriage ended. So before he was even old enough to remember it, his identity had already been rewritten once to suit the shape of his mother's life. He started as Philip Terry Jr., a child named for a father, and became Christopher Crawford, a child named for no one but her. That is not the kind of thing a small boy notices at the time. But it is the kind of thing that becomes part of the architecture of a person, the sense that who you are is something other people decide and can change without asking. And from very early on, Christopher pushed back against that house in the most direct way a child can. He ran. In March of 1951, when he was around 7 or 8 years old, Christopher ran away from home. Joan and the authorities searched for him, and he was eventually found, playing with other children in the neighborhood, as if he had simply walked out of one life and into an ordinary one, and seen no reason to come back. It was not the last time he would do it. Running became a pattern with him, a thing he returned to again and again throughout his childhood, the way some children return to a hiding place. Whatever was happening inside that house, this small boy kept deciding over and over that he would rather be anywhere else. Like Christina, he was sent to the Chadwick school. And like Christina, he grew up in the strange split between the public family and the private one. The boy in the matching outfit in the photographs, and the boy who kept slipping out the door. He would later support his sister's account of their childhood entirely. When Christina described a home of harsh discipline and frightening punishment, Christopher did not contradict her. He confirmed it, and by some accounts he was even more bitter about it than she was, more willing to say the hard things out loud. 2 of the 4 children remembered that house as something to escape. He was the second of them, and in some ways the first to start trying. As he got older, the running took different forms. There was military school, which was a common destination in those years for boys whose parents found them difficult to manage, and which was, for a boy who hated rules and authority, close to a contradiction in terms. Then came the largest departure of all. Christopher served in the military, and he went to Vietnam. A boy who had spent his childhood trying to get out of one house ended up on the other side of the world, in a war about as far from Brentwood and the famous name as it was possible to get. And here is where the record goes quiet, the way Christopher seems to have wanted it to. After the war, he did not write a book. He did not give long interviews. He did not trade on the name. He worked ordinary jobs, maintenance and repair work, the kind of labor that has nothing to do with Hollywood and asks nothing of a famous surname. He built a life in the corners of the world where no one was looking for the son of Joan Crawford. Because the son of Joan Crawford did not particularly want to be that. He had spent his whole childhood running from the house. As an adult, he simply kept the distance permanent. There is a quiet sadness in that, and it is a different kind of sadness than his sister's. Christina turned her pain into something public, into words and accusations, and eventually a book that the whole country would read. Christopher turned his into silence. He went into the ordinary world and pulled it over himself like a blanket. He let his sister do the speaking. When she described what their childhood had been, he stood behind her, but he did not stand in front of the cameras to do it. He had run from that house as a boy, and as a man he was still running, just more quietly, into a life so plain that the name attached to it could finally stop mattering. It is tempting to call him the forgotten child, and in the public memory he nearly is. But it would be more honest to say he was the child who chose to be forgotten, who decided that the only way to win against a name that large was to become someone no one would think to look for. The 2 oldest children, then, grew up certain they had survived something. One of them would say so to the world, and one of them would say it only to those who asked. But there were 2 other children in that same house, arriving a few years after Christopher, who grew up to remember a mother neither of their older siblings would recognize. And their story complicates everything. because everything you have heard so far, the harsh discipline, the punishments, the children running and the children sent away, the home that two people remembered as something to survive, was about to be contradicted by two more people who lived in the very same house, under the very same mother, and grew up insisting that none of it was true. Not exaggerated, not misremembered, simply not the home they knew. Kathy and Cindy were born on the 13th of January, 1947, fraternal twins, the daughters of a young woman named Theda Cotton, and their lives began with a loss before they could have any memory of it, because their birth mother died only 7 days after they came into the world. Theda had already arranged, before her death, for the girls to be placed for adoption. So within weeks, these two infants, who had lost their mother almost immediately, were carried into the Brentwood home of Joan Crawford and given her name. The adoption was finalized the following year. They were the last children Joan would bring home, and they were, in a sense, the most fully hers, raised by her from the very beginning of their lives, with no other parent and no memory of any home but this one. And what they remembered was not what their older siblings remembered. Kathy and Cindy described a mother who was strict, yes, but not cruel. A disciplinarian, certainly, in the way that many mothers of that era were disciplinarians, with rules and expectations and consequences. But they described those rules as the ordinary structure of a household, not the machinery of abuse. They said they had a good childhood. Cindy, asked directly about the most famous accusation of all, said plainly that she had never once seen her mother drunk. They remembered birthdays and holidays and a woman who was present in their lives, demanding but loving, the only mother they had ever wanted and the only one they recognized when they looked back. Now, you have to sit with that, honestly, because it is the hardest part of this entire story. It would be easy to decide that one set of children must be lying and the other must be telling the truth, that the home was either a house of horrors or it was not, and that only one version can be real. But life is not that tidy, and people are not that simple. It is entirely possible for a mother to be one thing to one child and something completely different to another. It is possible for a household to harden against the children who fought it and soften toward the children who did not. The twins were younger. They were the babies of the family. They were temperamentally different from the willful Christina and the runaway Christopher, and children who do not provoke a parent's worst instincts often never see those instincts at all. That does not make Christina a liar, and it does not make the twins deluded. It may simply mean that there were two homes inside that one house, and that which one you lived in depended on who you were when you walked through the door. Kathy, the twin who would live the longest, put it as well as anyone ever has. She said that she and Christina had grown up in the same house, but that they had not grown up in the same home. She said Christina had her own reality. There is no bitterness required to believe that. It might be the truest single sentence anyone in this family ever spoke. Two children, the same address, two entirely separate worlds, and neither one able to convince the other that what they remembered was real. The twins grew up, and they grew out of the spotlight in a way Christina never did, and Christopher only managed through silence. They married. Kathy married a Navy man named Jerome Lalonde and had 2 children. Cindy married a man named John Jordan and had 2 children of her own. Both marriages eventually ended, and both women raised their children largely on their own, devotedly, by every account that has come down to us. They built quiet, ordinary lives, the kind that do not generate headlines, and for a long stretch of years that is exactly what they had, ordinary lives, far from the noise. And in 1990, decades after the woman who carried them had died 7 days into their lives, Cindy did something that closed a very long circle. She tracked down their biological father, a man named Jordan, living in a small town in Tennessee, who had abandoned their mother before they were born and had never known what became of the children he left behind. Through him, and through the surviving family of their birth mother, Kathy and Cindy finally learned where they had truly come from. The two girls who had lost their first mother before they could remember her got to see, at last, the shape of the family they had been taken from. So that was the household, fully assembled and fully divided. 4 children, 2 of whom would spend their lives saying their mother had wounded them, and 2 of whom would spend their lives defending her against exactly that charge. While Joan Crawford was alive, that division stayed mostly private, a family disagreement held behind closed doors. But Joan Crawford would not be alive forever, and what she set down on paper before she died would tear that division wide open and turn a private family wound into a public war. Nobody wakes up one morning estranged from their mother. It does not happen like that. It happens the way erosion happens, slowly, over years, a little more ground giving way each season until one day you look up, and the distance between you is so wide you cannot remember when it would still have been possible to cross it. That is what happened between Joan Crawford and her 2 oldest children. Not a single explosion, but a long, quiet wearing away. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the family that had posed for all those portraits had begun to come apart at the edges. The twins were still close to their mother, still inside the warm version of the household. But Christina and Christopher were drifting, each in their own direction, each carrying a version of their childhood that left no room for closeness. Christina was building a career and a series of marriages, putting both a profession and a coastline of distance between herself and Brentwood. Christopher had already physically removed himself from the family's world, into the military, into the war, into the plain working life he chose afterward. The 2 children who had remembered the house as something to escape had, by adulthood, simply finished escaping. In 1955, Joan married for the 4th and final time to Alfred Steele, an executive who would become the head of Pepsi-Cola. It was, by the standards of her earlier marriages, a genuine partnership, and it reshaped the back half of her life. She threw herself into the company, traveling the country and the world on its behalf, becoming as much a businesswoman as an actress. But Steele died suddenly in 1959, only 4 years into the marriage, and Joan was widowed. The home that had once been full of children was emptying out. The children were grown or growing, scattered or scattering, and the woman who had assembled that family one adoption at a time was increasingly alone inside the life she had built. And as the distance with her oldest children settled into something permanent, Joan began doing the thing that people do when relationships have curdled past repair. She began revising her will. Over the years, she rewrote it more than once, and the question of who would be remembered and who would be cut out became, in its way, the last live wire of feeling between her and the children she had lost. A will is a strange kind of document. It is supposed to be about money and property. But for a family like this one, it became something else. A final accounting, a last chance for a mother to put on paper what she could no longer say in a room. Each revision was a verdict, and the verdict on Christina and Christopher was hardening. You have to understand what it costs a person to reach that point. Joan Crawford had spent her whole life building a family precisely because she had grown up without one. She had gone around the laws of California, around the obstacles, around her own inability to bear children, all so that no child of hers would ever feel the way she had felt as a girl, unwanted and alone. And now, decades later, she was sitting with lawyers deciding which of those very children to remove from her life in the only permanent way left to her. There is no version of that which is not a kind of grief. Whatever you believe about what happened in that house, the woman drafting those documents was, on some level, presiding over the failure of the one thing she had wanted most. Her final years were spent largely in New York, in an apartment, increasingly withdrawn from the public that had once followed her every move. The famous beauty, the woman whose face had sold 1,000 magazine covers, became reclusive and private. There are accounts that she grew uncomfortable being seen. That after a particularly unflattering set of photographs, she retreated from the camera that had defined her entire existence. The control she had exercised over everything, her image, her household, her children, narrowed down to the only thing she could still command, which was the size of her own world. She made that world smaller and smaller. And on the far side of that distance, her two oldest children were living lives she was barely part of. Christina, the daughter who was most like her, was somewhere out there with her own marriages and her own grievances, and, though no one yet knew it, the beginnings of a manuscript taking shape in her mind. Christopher was in the working-class quiet he had chosen, raising the distance like a wall. Neither of them was coming back. Joan must have known that. You do not keep rewriting a will to exclude your children if you still believe reconciliation is possible. You rewrite it because you have stopped believing. The twins remained close. Kathy and Cindy stayed in the warm version of their mother, to the very end, and they would carry that warmth forward as fiercely as their siblings carried their pain. So the family arrived at the threshold of Joan's death, already cleaved cleanly in two children inside the circle and 2 children outside it, with their mother holding the pen that would make the division official and final. She did not have much time left, and when she died, the document she had been revising for years would do exactly what she had built it to do. It would speak for her after she was gone, and what it said would set off everything that followed. Joan Crawford died on the 10th of May, 1977, in her apartment in New York. She was somewhere in her 70s, the exact number still uncertain even in death, fitting for a woman who had kept the year of her birth a moving target her whole life. She died of a heart attack. By the end, she had grown deeply private, a recluse in her own home, the great star of the studio era, reduced to a quiet woman in a quiet set of rooms. There was no deathbed reconciliation. The 2 children who had drifted away did not come back in her final hours. Whatever might have been said between them was left unsaid, and then it was too late to say it. And then her will was read. To the twins, Kathy and Cindy, she left money. To a number of her favored charities, she left money. The will distributed her estate among the people and causes she had chosen to honor. But it is not what the will gave that anyone remembers. It is what it withheld, and the words she used to withhold it. In the document, Joan Crawford addressed her 2 oldest children directly. She declared that she was leaving nothing to her son Christopher and nothing to her daughter Christina. And then she added a single clause that has echoed through every account of this family ever written since. She wrote that it was her intention to make no provision for them, for reasons which were well known to them. For reasons which are well known to them. Sit with that line for a moment, because of all the things in this story, it may be the one that does the most work. It is a sentence written by a lawyer, cold and procedural on its surface, the kind of language that appears in estate documents all the time. But underneath the legal phrasing is something else entirely. It is a mother's last word in an argument that had gone on for decades. It is an accusation with no details attached, a closed door with the reasons sealed behind it. She does not explain. She does not justify. She simply asserts that there are reasons, that the children know what they are, and that she is taking those reasons with her. It is the verbal equivalent of turning away. And it is devastating in both directions, depending on which child you are reading it as. If you are Christina or Christopher, that line is the final cruelty of a cruel parent, a mother who could not even in death speak plainly, who reached out from beyond to wound them one more time, with a phrase deliberately designed to imply guilt while naming none. The reasons are well known to them, as if they had done something, as if the rupture had been their fault and theirs alone. To a child who believed they had survived an abusive home, that sentence is the abuser getting the last word, encoded forever in a legal record. But if you are one of the twins, or anyone who loved Joan and believed her, that same line reads completely differently. It reads as restraint. It reads as a mother who had been wounded by these two children, who could have used her will to air every grievance in public, and who instead chose to say almost nothing. Reasons well known to them. She does not list their failures. She does not name the hurts. She gives them the dignity of silence and keeps the family's private pain private even as she closes the door. To this reading, the line is not cruelty. It is a kind of mercy, or at least a refusal to do in death what she could have done. The same 11 words, two completely opposite meanings, and no way, then or now, to know for certain which one Joan intended. That is the whole story of this family, compressed into a single clause. Even her final sentence about her children splits down the middle, and which side of it you stand on depends entirely on which version of her you believe. For Christina, the disinheritance did something more than wound her. It confirmed her. Here, in black and white, in the legal record, was proof of exactly the kind of mother she had always said Joan was, a woman whose love came with conditions and could be withdrawn entirely. The will did not soften her. It hardened her, and it freed her. Because there was no longer any relationship left to protect, no reconciliation left to hope for, no living mother whose feelings had to be considered. Joan Crawford had drawn the final line, and Christina, the eldest, the fiercest, the one most like her mother, was now free to respond in the only way that had ever been fully hers. She had words. She had a whole childhood's worth of them, stored up over a lifetime. And with her mother gone, and the door sealed shut, there was nothing left to stop her from writing them all down. What she wrote would not stay in the family. It would not stay private. It would become one of the most famous and most divisive books about a parent ever published, and it would turn the quiet division inside this family into a war fought out in the open, in front of the entire country. In 1978, a little more than a year after Joan Crawford died, Christina published a book. She called it Mommy Dearest. And the title alone, 2 words, one of them a child's tender name for her mother, and the other dripping with bitter irony, told you everything about what was inside before you opened the cover. The book described a childhood that the public had never imagined behind those smiling family portraits. It portrayed Joan Crawford as an alcoholic, as a woman whose moods swung without warning, as a mother whose discipline crossed into cruelty and whose need for control reached into every corner of her children's lives. It described punishments and rages and a home governed by fear. It took the woman the world had adored, the glamorous star, the devoted mother of those photographs, and it turned her inside out, showing the public a private person they had never been allowed to see, as her daughter said she had truly been. It became a sensation. It sold and sold. It is often credited as one of the first of its kind, the celebrity child's tell-all, the book that opened a door countless others would later walk through. Before Mommy Dearest, the children of the famous did not write books like this. After it, the genre existed. Christina had not only written about her mother, she had, in a sense, invented a new way for the children of icons to speak, and the country could not stop reading. And then, in 1981, came the film. Faye Dunaway played Joan Crawford, and she played her at a pitch so heightened, so ferocious, that the performance escaped the movie entirely and lodged itself permanently in the culture. The film was meant to be a serious drama. It became something else, something its makers never intended, a piece of camp so over the top that audiences laughed where they were supposed to gasp. One scene in particular, built around a mother's rage over wire coat hangers, became one of the most quoted and parodied moments in film history. The line from that scene is still repeated by people who have never seen the movie and could not tell you who Joan Crawford was. And here is the bitter irony at the center of it all. The film that was supposed to be the definitive indictment of Joan Crawford ended up nearly erasing the real woman altogether. She stopped being a person and became a punchline, a Halloween costume, a screaming caricature in a nightgown. Whatever Christina had intended, the cultural memory that resulted was not a careful reckoning with a difficult mother. It was a cartoon. The actual Joan Crawford, with all her contradictions, with the poverty she had escaped, and the family she had so badly wanted to build, disappeared behind the wire hanger. There were no winners in that particular outcome. There rarely are. But the deepest wound the book opened was not in the culture. It was inside the family. Because the two people best positioned to confirm Christina's account were Kathy and Cindy, the twins who had grown up in the same house. And they did not confirm it. They rejected it, completely and furiously. They said the mother in that book was not the mother they had known. They said they had not seen the drunkenness, had not lived the cruelty, had not survived the home Christina described, because as far as they were concerned, that home had not existed. Joan's first husband, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the man who had known her longest, sided with the twins, and Christopher, the runaway, the silent brother, sided with Christina, endorsing her account, adding his own bitterness to hers. So the family did not just split. It split exactly along the line it had always been divided by. The two children who had remembered the house as something to escape stood on one side. The two children who had remembered it as home stood on the other. And now, with Joan dead and a best-selling book between them, that lifelong disagreement about what their childhood had been was no longer a quiet matter held behind closed doors. It was public. It was permanent. It was being argued about by strangers who had never met any of them. The bitterness curdled into something legal. At one point, Christina claimed that their mother had lied about Kathy and Cindy even being twins, a claim that struck at the twins' very sense of who they were, their bond, their shared origin. Kathy took her to court over it. She sued her own sister for defamation, and she won. Think about what that means. Two sisters, raised under the same roof by the same woman, ended up in a courtroom, one suing the other over the basic facts of their own family, and a judge had to decide between them. That is how completely this family had come apart. Not just estranged, not just disagreeing, but adversaries in a court of law, asking the legal system to rule on whose version of their childhood was true. The twins and their families broke off all contact with Christina and with Christopher, too. The 4 children Joan Crawford had gathered one at a time, the family she had built to cure her own loneliness, had finished dividing into 2 camps that would never speak again. The book had made Christina famous and made the family permanent strangers to one another. And the woman at the center of it could not say a word, because she was gone, and the only version of her that millions of people would ever carry was a screaming figure on a movie screen holding a wire hanger. That was the legacy. Now there was only the question of what became of the 4 children themselves. After the books and the lawsuits and the films, when the noise finally died down, and they had to go on living the rest of their lives. So what happened to them? The 4 children gathered one at a time by a woman who only wanted not to be alone. In the end, they scattered, and then, one by one, they were gone. Christina, the eldest, the fiercest, the one who had set all of it in motion, very nearly did not survive the decade in which her own book made her famous. In 1981, the same year the film of Mommy Dearest reached theaters, she suffered a stroke. It was severe, nearly fatal, and it left her having to relearn the most basic functions of a body that had stopped obeying her. There is a strange and terrible symmetry in that. The year her version of her mother conquered the culture was the year her own life almost ended, and she spent it not enjoying her fame, but learning again how to speak and move. She fought her way back through years of physical therapy, and when she recovered, she did something her mother might, in another life, have recognized and even admired. She refused to disappear. She left Hollywood behind entirely. She moved to Idaho, to the quiet of the mountains, about as far from the studio world as a person could get. She ran a bed and breakfast. She kept writing, publishing more books over the years. She built a life on her own terms, far from the cameras, a life that was unmistakably hers and no one else's. Whatever you make of the war she waged against her mother's memory, the woman herself did not crumble. She took the will that had disinherited her and the childhood she said had wounded her, and she turned them into a life she had chosen rather than one that had been chosen for her. Of the 4 children, she is the only one still living. Christopher, the boy who kept running, ran out his life the way he had always wanted to, quietly and out of view. He never came back into the public eye, never traded on the name, never gave the world the satisfaction of watching him. He worked his ordinary jobs and lived his ordinary life and held his bitterness close. And in 2006, he died of cancer in his early 60s. He had spent his whole life trying to be someone no one would come looking for, and in the end, the world mostly honored that wish. His death passed with little notice. The boy who ran away from the famous house at 7 years old had finally gotten all the way gone. Cindy, one of the twins who had defended her mother to the last, died the following year, in October of 2007. She was 60 years old. She had spent her life insisting on the warm version of Joan, the strict but loving mother, the woman she never once saw drunk. She had raised her 2 children largely alone after her marriage ended, devotedly by every account. She went to her grave believing in a mother her older siblings said had never existed. And there is no reason at all to think she was lying. She simply remembered a different woman. She always had. And Kathy, the last of them, the twin who had said the truest sentence in the whole story, lived the longest. She was the one who had told the world that she and Christina grew up in the same house, but not the same home, that Christina had her own reality. She had married, raised her children, reconnected with the biological family she and her sister had been taken from as infants. She had even gone to court to defend the facts of her own origin and won. She lived into the next century long enough to see the whole saga settle into history. And on the 10th of January, 2020, just days before what would have been her 73rd birthday, Kathy died of lung cancer after fighting it for 6 years. With her went the last living voice of the warm version of Joan Crawford. The defense rested permanently when she did. So that is how it ends. 4 children, 4 separate fates, and not a single shared truth among them about the woman who raised them. One survived a stroke and built a new life in the mountains. One ran into silence and died out of view. And the 2 who arrived as infants, having already lost one mother, spent their lives defending the second one, and then they too were gone, the warm memory dying with them and the bitter memory living on in books and on film. There is no tidy lesson here, and it would be an insult to all 4 of them to pretend there is. You cannot stand outside this family and declare who was right. The twins were not lying. Christina was not lying. They lived in the same house and walked out of it carrying memories so different that they ended up as strangers, as adversaries, as people who could no longer be in the same room. And maybe that is the real tragedy of Joan Crawford's 4 children. Not the disinheritance, not the abuse, if there was abuse, not the books or the lawsuits or the wire hanger that swallowed their mother's memory whole. The real tragedy is that there were 4 of them. 4 people who began in the same place, and they could never agree on where that place had been. Go back to the beginning. A girl in San Antonio who grew up unwanted and poor and alone, and who decided that the answer to all of it was to build a family of her own, a house full of children who would never feel the way she had felt. She went around the law to do it. She gathered them one at a time. She gave them her name, her home, her enormous and complicated love. And what she got, in the end, was a family that split clean down the middle and never healed. 2 children who fled her, and 2 who defended her, all 4 of them now folded back into the silence she came from. She had wanted, more than anything, not to be alone. And the saddest thing of all is that the family she built to cure that loneliness spent its last decades unable to sit at the same table, divided by the very thing she had tried hardest to give them, a home. They simply never agreed on what it had been. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.